All right. Welcome to our second edition today of Meet Our Contributors for another time zone. Today we are joined by four awesome contributors, five including myself, and we are taking questions from the Meet Our Contributors Slack channel on the Kubernetes instance, as well as Twitter with the hashtag of Kate's MOC. We'll do some quick introductions and then we'll get right into the questions. For folks following along, these can be general questions about the contributors themselves, how they got into open source, general contribution questions to Kubernetes, as well as specific questions about the process itself, for instance, ED testing, etc. So we'll start with introductions. Solly, why don't you start first?
Great. Hi, I'm Solly Ross. I work at Red Hat, and I'm also the SIG lead for Kubernetes SIG autoscaling. I've been working on Kubernetes for about 3 years now. And I like most parts of Kubernetes.
And then Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris. I work on cluster OPSI infrastructure stuff, kubeadmin, the cluster API. I worked on COPS for a while. I wrote Kubicorn, leader of SIG AWS and cluster API, general mischief causer.
True that. Jeff?
Hi, I'm Jeff Grafton, GitHub username on Slack XD. I've been working on Kubernetes for probably about 3 years or so as well, I think. And lately, I've been working on build and test infrastructure. So a lot of the stuff going on in test infra and the test infra repository. Also working on Bazel stuff. I don't know if I mentioned I work at Google. So I'm working with the Google engineering productivity team for a lot of these improvements as well.
Oh yeah, I work at Heptio too.
And then George.
Hi, I'm George Castro, and this is my dog Luna. Mostly I'll be running the stream and answering questions in Slack, and I work at Heptio as a community manager. Welcome, everyone.
And what membership level is Luna now?
She's a new contributor. She's a new contributor. She eats our food. She's working on her first pull request. Very hard, as you can tell.
She dog foods everything.
That's exactly what I look like when I'm working on Kubernetes.
All right, for real questions, y'all. All right, so the first question was directed towards Chris, but I'd also like to hear some responses from the rest of the crew. But Justin in the Slack channel would like to know, how did you get from where you are in tech before being a contributor to Kubernetes? And it looks like they are inspired by a lot of awesome folks who are building great open source tech, but the person's coming from a very non-open source industry, so it's hard to know where they start. So Chris, why don't you tell us your story?
Okay. So I started off like pulling wire in a data center, like in the long ago. And that turned into bash scripts, and that turned into Python, and then that turned into Scala, and then it turned into Scala SRE work, which made me DevOps. And throughout this whole journey, I like always envied people in open source. Like my GitHub had like 1 follower, and I never had any commits. Like I would have like 1 green square, and I would like always daydreamed about being like more involved in open source. And so I just started writing tools just like randomly, just stuff around my life. And eventually that landed me a job where they were like, you're going to go work open source a lot. And it was really scary at first because I thought I was cheating all the time at work. I was like, this is like open source. I can't do this at work. And now it's like my full-time job. I just pretty much everything I do is open source. I don't even have like a Heptio private GitHub account or anything. Like everything is just in the wild that you can use.
So what's your advice to folks who are coming from non-traditional backgrounds going into open source?
I think it's a little bit of like, you got to kind of take a risk. Like you got to take the jump. You just got to kind of go for it and know that people are going to look at your code. That's like the point. And if you can find somebody on the inside to like help you navigate the waters at first, that will probably help a lot. There's been a couple of people who I've kind of like given a little bit of guidance to and like for a couple of weeks, and like now they're contributing to Kubernetes full time. Just, helping get them over that first little bump. So I can volunteering if I can help anyone. yeah, I would say find somebody on the inside if you
You
can.
officially have 100 new emails in your email
Yeah.
box right now.
I have a yes problem. I always do this, and then people like hit me up, and then I'm like, oh, I wish there was more hours in the day so I could spend with everyone.
Jeff, what about you? Tell us a little bit about where you were before being a contributor to Kubernetes and how you got involved.
Yeah, so I've been working with the engineering productivity teams here at Google for quite a while. So sort of at Google, we have a role called the software engineer and tools and infrastructure. So they're sort of people that are software engineers that are kind of specialized in a lot of the tools and infrastructure engineering productivity parts of Google. So basically helping developers be more productive. So often writing things like building testing frameworks, being able to analyze test results, improving build, things like all of the various infrastructure that developers need to sort of be productive and kind of get things out of their way so they can write code that's hopefully bug-free or at least fewer bugs and works well and is performant and all these sorts of things. And so basically Kubernetes, when it was still sort of a younger project 3 years ago or so, there was not really anyone from test infra or anything really. It was kind of focusing on testing. There were a few SWEs on the from Google that were kind of starting to look into running some tests and things like that, but there wasn't really a lot kind of there. And so they were starting to staff up a team. So it was kind of something new and exciting. I was looking for something new, and I hadn't really done a whole lot of open source before. You know, I consumed a lot of open source, hadn't really contributed. So it was really exciting after working at Google for a while and kind of doing all sorts of things where, you know, it was fun projects, but there was nothing that like I could really show anyone, you know, I was doing necessarily. So it was really neat to kind of get a chance to actually work in the open source community. And it's been a lot of fun getting to kind of work with people across all sorts of different regions and companies and cultures and backgrounds. And it's been a lot of fun just kind of getting a very different perspective from a lot of places. And I think, you know, the Kubernetes community has been very good at being supportive of all of those, everyone contributing. I think it's been a very healthy community, which is great.
Plus one, a healthy community.
We did not pay Jeff to say that either. That was not a sponsored message. Sully, what about you?
So I worked before this. So I did kind of some open source through college. I've been programming since I was a kid. So open source was kind of consuming open source was a good way to get cool pieces of software because kids don't have access to $2,000 budgets to buy more expensive software. And so I was kind of familiar with open source a bit and started doing it more in college, and then got hired at Red Hat out of an internship in college. And that's when I really started, I think, like just embracing open source wholeheartedly. And I worked on OpenStack a bit before coming to work on Kubernetes. But I was looking for a little bit of a change of pace, and one of my coworkers was like, "Oh, there's this really cool project. You should, if you're interested in working on something new, you should come work on it." And I found Kubernetes. It was like, "This is awesome," and that's where I've been ever since.
Awesome, really cool stories. George, do you want to tell your story?
Sure. So I was getting out of the Army and didn't really know what to do with the rest of my life. So I ended up at like a traditional IT place. It was like a defense contractor doing like Outlook support. And then one day I realized I'm going to do this the rest of my life if I don't figure out computers. And at the time, Linux was kind of a new thing. So I bought an old computer for like $100 and made my own mail server at home and figured it out with friends on IRC at Ars Technica. Found some friends. We started our own Linux column in Ars Technica, and that was like 10 years ago now. And then just kind of fell into it. Eventually, I knew enough to like snag a sysadmin job at a university. And once I got exposed to students that knew a bunch of stuff, we were able to do a lot of experimentation. And then one thing led to another. Worked at a distro for a while, and then ended up here. But the thing I wanted to tell everyone who's listening to all this, I remember I was getting out, and back then Mozilla was kind of like the one open source project that people kind of understood because the kernel was still like this weird thing that came on floppies you didn't understand. And I remember just randomly mailing people there saying, "Hey, here's my resume. How do I get into this?" I remember just showing up at a Sun building in California with like my resume and being like, "I want a Unix," but I didn't know what to do. So One thing I want to encourage people that are listening to this is like those days are kind of gone, and these days having this experience is actually really, really high in demand. So like if you want to do this kind of stuff, the power's kind of in your court to find a place that's going to let you do that kind of thing. So I encourage you to like learn as much as you can and do that kind of stuff, because eventually it did take over the world.
Awesome. Really good responses, y'all. Sounds like a lot of backgrounds are present. All right. Next one is actually from Chris. Chris asked a question in Slack, and she wants to know what's one thing that everyone would change about Kubernetes if they could go back in time.
I feel like this is such a great question.
I think it's a good question. That's why I was like, I'm going to throw this out there. Like, Jeff or Solly, your go.
All right, I can go. So there were some questionable API decisions that were made over the course. Some things where we didn't end up understanding, we didn't foresee how API aggregation would work, and how much we would be focused on extending things, I think. And there were some little things over the course of time that have just become a pain in the butt. I have to say, like, I really like a lot of Kubernetes architecture, and I think it does a lot of things right. I might also make more use of self-links. I think self-links are kind of a cool concept that could be used to make things easier to interact with the API in certain cases that we haven't really done.
Jeff, anything to add?
Yeah, so I can at least, from testing perspective, I think one thing that I think we leaned too heavily on E2E testing, where we have to sort of stand up an entire cluster on some provider and run tests, which end up being flaky and take a really long time to run and hard to debug and all sorts of things, where there are going to be certain classes of tests that actually interact with providers that are going to require real clusters. But I think there's a lot of tests where we wrote the E2E framework. It was easy to write tests in that. They're kind of functional tests that are just doing sort of testing very small parts of the system, and would probably be better for an integration test or something that runs on your local machine. And while we have some of that, I think we have relied too much on that, and we haven't made it easy enough to write good integration tests and migrate things from E2E test to integration test. And I think that's something that focusing more on that in the past would have been great. And I think if we can move that in that direction in the future, where there's less and less and less on E2E tests, probably E2E tests should be like the conformance tests and not much else. But we can, that's obviously a huge point of contention, but I think there's room for improvement there for sure.
And I'm actually going to hijack this because that's a question that I get all of the time from contributors is the when do I do EDE tests, how, why, who. So if there's like one thing that you could tell contributors that are listening about EDE tests, maybe like a tip or a trick, or even maybe like the best documentation, what would your tip be?
I'll admit I haven't actually really worked on the EDB tests in a while. So I helped get some of them going, but I haven't really done a whole lot of that, and I haven't been so involved in actually writing the tests. So I don't know if I have the best advice, but I think it's kind of the question. It's sort of, if it's something that really depends on actual implementation details of the providers, or if you actually need to test the network or actually need to test disk functions or volumes or things like that. Those are probably examples where you actually require E2E tests. Whereas if it's kind of a functional aspect of the cluster itself, like scheduling or something like that, then maybe maybe it's not something that you need to stand up an entire cluster to make sure that your pods get rescheduled properly or something like that. So the more that you can kind of, again, I don't think there's been a great, the frameworks for writing integration tests is not as well developed. I know people are working on this, and I'm not fully up to date with all the details, but that's kind of where the breakup happens. And I think there's also efforts to be able to run the EDB tests more as integration tests on your local machine. So I know DIMS and some other people are working on some stuff, DIMS, and I think Quentin and a number of people are working on kind of different approaches. And I know there's some other existing ones on running local clusters. And so that I think helps being able to run some UV tests and then test them yourself without having to necessarily pay Google or Amazon or Microsoft or whoever to actually create a cluster. But I think this is definitely still a place that we're looking for improvements and need help here.
Dims and Aaron were on the session earlier, and most of the questions that we received were actually testing related. And they did, for those that are watching right now and want more info on testing, I'd say the first 20 minutes were mostly testing related, and Dims shared a screen with a bunch of dashboards and cool tools that you can use. So definitely check that out. All right, Chris. Was that good for, Sally, did you have something to add?
I was just going to say, as a general testing comment, like if you ever find yourself saying, I can't test this as a blah, it has to be a blah, that's probably a good indication that you need to rethink how you've actually written your code. So if you're like, oh, well, I can't write this as a unit test, I need to write it as an end-to-end test. Like maybe go back and think, is there something I could break up? Can I make this easier to unit test so that I don't have to have as many end-to-end tests or integration tests, or, so that it's less flaky when I actually write the tests?
Chris?
Just a comment, since we're talking about testing, and I'm going to do a shameless Heptio plug really quick, but we have Sonaboy, which is conformance testing, which is the layer above testing the Kubernetes components, but that's modular as well. So as soon as you are in a situation where you want to validate, do a sanity check on your actual cluster, there's a lot of work going on with conformance, which is the layer above as well.
All right. Now we have a silly question for Chris, and I'm going to allow silly. Chris, what's your least favorite mountain and why? And for those that are listening, Chris is an avid mountaineer and climber. So, Chris, what's your least favorite mountain and why?
So right now, my least favorite mountain is probably also my most favorite mountain, which is right over there. I'm actually looking at it right now. It's Mount Rainier. And the reason I kind of am really pissed off at that mountain right now is because I've tried to climb it twice and failed both times. So I'm on this, I'm going to go get it campaign. But it's I know I can't swear on this call because we're streaming right now, but I would be using swear words if possible to describe how I feel about this mountain.
Yeah, we'll only allow for so much silly.
Yeah.
Good. All right, the next question is, are there any best practices when asking questions as a contributor and getting feedback? And I feel like this might also go into what Chris said earlier about finding someone. What's the best way of just getting the attention that you need, whether it's on a PR, whether it's just general questions from either a contributor or a group of contributors? Whoever wants to go, just jump.
I feel like this is such a great question for so many reasons, because one, every person who's requesting help is different, and every person they would potentially be requesting help from is different. So I think there's a little bit of an exercise of understanding the inputs and outputs of both yourself and the people you're working with. And I think you're going to see, just be ready, be prepared to see everything from, I want to do things by the second at runtime in Slack, and that's how we work. Or we're a very concurrent team here, and everything needs to be documented in GitHub so that we can all read things and contribute concurrently because of different time zones. So I think for me, it was learning the scale of it. Either is super, super quick right now, or it's takes a couple of days and you just have to document everything you think, and just knowing that every contribution is going to be somewhere in that scale.
I'd say don't, if you're not getting traction on a GitHub issue, don't be afraid to bug people in the appropriate Slack channels. See if you can figure out what the appropriate Slack channel is. See if you can find a person that you think might be relevant, and don't be afraid to bug that person, because the the worst that's going to happen is they're going to be like, well, I'm not responsible for that, but you should probably go ask this other person. You know, so like if you think you're getting ignored, you're probably not getting ignored intentionally. It's probably just like there's a lot of bugs, there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of PRs, and it's hard to keep track of them all. And so like personally, like as a SIG auto scaling lead, I'll sometimes find stuff on GitHub, and people will ping me, and I'll usually try to be quick to respond to those on Slack.
I would really want to echo the "don't be afraid to bother people" sentiment here. Like I've had a few people ping me for something, and it comes through at like 4 a.m. my time, and I completely forget about it, and then I find out later that they like felt they were abandoned or their contribution wasn't welcome. And really, it's like, please continue to ping us, continue to message us. We're not ignoring you. We're busy, and like we're in meetings and doing calls like this. So like we want your input, and sometimes it's a good thing to be a little pushy.
Yeah, a lot of us keep weird hours. Like I am nominally in Eastern Standard Time. Will sometimes answer pings at 1 a.m, but will sometimes not answer pings after 4. And so like I'm not ignoring you. So just keep pestering me. That looks like I am.
Jeff, did you have anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think both what Sully and Chris were saying is very much accurate. A lot of us, we are drowning in email. There's constantly things going on, constantly issues and PRs and other things. And so often, if there's something urgent or like you think you're getting forgotten, a ping in Slack, if somebody's actually assigned as a reviewer is totally reasonable. I know one of the questions I feel like is also, how do I even necessarily know, like if you just create an issue or a PR, it may or may not actually get assigned to somebody or the right person. Our automation tries to, like, if you create a PR, review it, tries to assign to somebody it thinks owns that code. And hopefully they look at it and reassign it and so forth. Sometimes that doesn't work, so you may need to ping them. In some cases, maybe you don't know who sort of owns something, and so you can kind of try to guess which SIG it is and maybe go into one of the Slack channels in SIG, or one of the SIG appropriate Slack channel, or most SIGs also I think have Google groups, which people usually monitor. So those are good ways to do it. I've also in some cases done a lot of Git archaeology, kind of try to figure out, okay, if I'm like trying to modify some file or understand why something was chosen, if you're lucky, somebody actually documented this and there was a design document or something like that. If you're less lucky, it was maybe discussed in the PR at some point. So you can kind of try to go find the original PR where something was added, and you can sometimes find some discussion there. That's one of the advantages, I think, of a lot of the code review process is that, people will often kind of discuss like, oh, we did it this way because something, something, something. It's not always documented necessarily why that's happened, which is unfortunate. But that's kind of one way I've been able to track down, why is this done this way? This doesn't make any sense. And I can go back, look 3 years and say like, oh, this was the context of why this decision was made. And, you can either track down that person and see if it's still an issue, or you kind of get that information that way. So I think looking at the history, the Git blame log, and everything else for certain things is a great way to kind of also track down people who might own things, or at least know who currently owns something if they no longer own that.
Yeah, I will quite frequently, look through some Git blame, grab a commit ID, paste it into the search box in GitHub, and be like, all right, who did this? What was the reasons? Also, this is kind of like something that develops over time as you work in the Kubernetes project, but like have a good mental model of like just like a couple people from each area that you can ask about questions. Like, if you're like, I have absolutely no idea where to start, Git blame is not being helpful, or it's more of an abstract thing, like, just try to, keep in mind, like, okay, who answered my questions in the past? And, because they can be a good starting point and point you at other people.
All right. Chris, if you're typing, hit mute.
Yeah, I think just to reiterate what Sully was mentioning, like those of us who have been on the project for 3 years probably know a lot of people who work on the project, or at least kind of big ideas. So if somebody were to ask me like, hey, I have this problem with something, I probably don't know how to actually, how that part of the system works, but I probably know a few people who work on that, and I'm happy to sort of bounce you in that direction. And I think a lot of contributors are like that.
Also, I just want to +1 documentation. Like if you want to help out and help write docs or fix spelling errors, or even if just a sentence seems like it's worded funny, like that is a great way to get involved, meet the people you need to meet, start working with them, understand the process. And we desperately, desperately need all the documentation help we can. +1 from Paris, +10 from Chris Nova.
And George, you had something to add too. Oh no, I guess.
I think we're gonna get like a plus a dog or something.
Oh, George is +1 as well.
I did have one thing to add, just to those of you that are submitting pull requests. A lot of the things that you think would work on other projects won't work in Kubernetes. So Kubernetes currently right now has 1,067 open pull requests. So things like GitHub notifications and, oh, that person should have gotten an email when I responded, with their review and stuff like that. Generally speaking, that just doesn't work. You almost kind of have to actively ping the person. So if you're depending on that person reading an email or getting a GitHub notification, probably not.
I think it would be helpful to point out, like, because I've had people ask me this in the past, like, how do I stay on top of GitHub notifications? And like, I spent my first year of contributing to Kubernetes, like super, super crazy intense Gmail filters, and tried to filter everything. And ultimately, I just like between the Kubernetes GitHub notifications and the Linux kernel mailing list, like I was getting over 1,000 emails a day. So I finally just got to the point where I just turned off all notifications. And if I happen to go check them in GitHub, I do. But otherwise, it's like me just stumbling through projects is how I see stuff. And I'm like, oh, there's my name. I should respond to that.
I basically spend the first hour at least of like, I'll sit down, I'll have my morning stand up or whatever, and then I'll spend an hour or sometimes more just like checking my GitHub notifications on the interface and like going through and doing a quick like, do I need to pay attention to this or not? And then I'll go through and do a second pass of like actually actively interacting with it. And that workflow is a little bit time consuming, but yeah, the email notifications, just like, I could not do that.
I feel like I should just quickly point out this works for some people who are dealing with notifications and all of these. The test env team has on Kubernetes, which is kind of one of our dashboards, there's a PR dashboard, which kind of shows you which PRs are assigned to you, which things need actual action from you based on if somebody's pushed new code or test results have come in or comments. And we're certainly working on trying to improve this, make this more useful, but it's at least one way to kind of try to help triage so that when I, like for example, as a maintainer, I might go review a bunch of PRs and I'll send off comments, and then I need to know when I actually need to look at them again when somebody has come back and replied or fixed things. And so it tries to help with that problem.
Do we currently have a link to that from like the Prow menu? Because that might be a good place to get a link to that.
I looked for it there. I don't remember seeing it. But
yeah, it's a really cool tool. It's like kates-kubernetes.appspot.com/PR.
Yep. I'll post the link inside the Slack, but now would be a good time to mention that if you Google for Kubernetes contributor cheat sheet, I have a little sheet that has like links to all these sorts of little tools, and PRs are accepted. It's in the community repo, and I'll post that in the Slack channel.
I didn't know.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll pass along that feedback about having a link in Prow. I know there also is some more changes coming in Prow for a user dashboard there, which will show your for your PRs what the test status of everything is, and it might somewhat also integrate with the other one, but I think there's possibly some room to improve that, so I'll be sure to pass that feedback along.
So related to Prow, quick comment. Pro tip, if you are new to Kubernetes and are confused by the bajillion different slash commands that we use, there is now a handy-dandy slash command cheat sheet built into Prow. So if you go to prow.kates.io, click on the hamburger menu and click on the commands, that will explain to you like what they all do and like what the arguments for are them and like who is allowed to do them. And so if you're like, what does the status command do? You can go there and you can find out, well, it helps us when we're managing like code freeze and stuff like that.
Awesome. For folks that don't know what Prow is, what's Prow?
Prow is a dashboard type thing that shows the status of a lot of different test infrastructure. Is that a good summary, Ixie?
Yeah, so it goes beyond that, I think. So Prow is sort of our continuous test infrastructure. So if you're familiar with something like Jenkins or Travis, Prow basically is that, except that it runs on Kubernetes. So it's a Kubernetes native application that schedules all sorts of various test jobs and has various things to report back to GitHub and interact with GitHub. So it both reports back to your test statuses, but also handles all the labels and other things. There's also a new part of Prow called Tide, which actually handles our merge automation. So if you are contributing to Kubernetes, you'll see in the main Kubernetes repository, we still have an older system called Munge GitHub or the Smit queue. But in pretty much all the other repositories, there's like basically automation such that contributors never actually manually merge any PRs. We basically require all PRs to be tested and approved and LG'd before they merge. And then there is a system which will ensure that everything still passes tests before it merges. So you don't have two things that conflict, that break tests and break the queue. So there's a whole lot of automation around sort of this PR workflow, and Prow powers all of that in addition to writing dashboards to be able to let people see the status of all these things.
Awesome. All right, next question. Now I have to scroll up here. All right. When you were learning Kubernetes, how did you go about learning the APIs and the design decisions that went into them?
So I can go first. So my method of learning code and learning big projects, it tends to be find a thing that looks like deceptively simple but gives me this nagging feeling that it's not going to be, and like trace it through the code base and try to avoid like the shortcut of asking people how this works, and instead like give yourself a few days and be like, all right, I'm going to understand from top to bottom, like how the REST mapper works, and just like spend time going through and being like, all right, I don't understand how this works. Let me see if I can add some debugging statements and strategic use of panics, and maybe delve, and see if you can just gradually expand what your knowledge is of a particular area. And I find it slows me down sometimes, right? But I end up having a much better knowledge of some little nitty gritty bit of Kubernetes, which comes in handy the next time that I have an issue, because I can be like, oh, I think I remembered seeing that while I was trying to figure out how exactly discovery information gets turned into recommendations for converting resources into kinds.
Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I can tell my story of how I started learning the APIs. I also enjoy kind of going this slow and dig through the code route with bigger projects. So my first big learning experience I went through in Kubernetes was, I thought it would be really simple to add a field to, I was working on deployments at the time. And I was like, oh, I'm just going to add a field and then try to see this in the cluster real time. And that exercise should demonstrate everything I needed to learn. 6 months later, I'm still working on that. And not really 6 months, it didn't take that long, but it was a good learning exercise and taught me how the APIs work, all the different components of the control plane. And eventually, ultimately was able to do an edit on a deployment and see my new field that I had added. And that was how I started learning all these things. I don't know if that helps.
Of course it helps. Jeff, did you want to add to that? Or plus one?
Maybe a little bit. I don't really do much development on Kubernetes proper, so I don't really have a whole lot of experience necessarily sort of diving into that. But I would say there's two things. One thing, I read this on Twitter somewhere recently, just kind of just to reiterate, I can't remember who said this, but allocating time to learning is totally something you should do. Everyone has to kind of take time to learn, and you're not going to just immediately know everything. It's going to take time, I think, as both Sally and Chris are saying, and that's okay. Another thing is that the Kubernetes system is pretty large and it's moving very fast. And so you shouldn't necessarily expect to know everything about it, and that's okay. I think it's pretty well segmented, and you can kind of focus on the part you're working on, but you shouldn't need to expect to know how the whole thing works. And I'm pretty sure there's not any contributor on this project that actually knows how the entire system works, because everything is constantly moving. So don't feel like, you can't contribute because you don't know how everything works. You focus on what you're working with and what it interacts with, but you'll continuously learn. But that's kind of, yeah.
I want to plus one that, and then just share like my first year of contributing and helping to maintain various parts of Kubernetes. I never went above the API. Like literally my whole workflow was just infrastructure and cops and kubeadmin and getting everything up and running. And then it was like, oh, this magical API I know nothing about is up. You guys go do all your fancy application land stuff. And I was still like a super valid member of the community. So plus one to that.
And don't be afraid to learn a new part and like be like, oh, I think this thing needs fixing. I'm going to figure out how to fix it and post a PR. Like my path through Kubernetes has bounced around so many places. I think like my first PR was about DNS. And then, I've had PRs for like some API machinery and client Go and API creation and pod auto scaling, obviously, and whatnot. Like, don't be afraid to like be like, I think this thing is broken or it doesn't quite do what I need it to, and try to figure out how it works and maybe post a fix or ask someone like, hey, was this intentional? Do you think this would be a good idea for me to post a fix? I've definitely seen new contributors do that. And it's really awesome because I'll be like, yeah, no, you have a great point. Sometimes I'll even be like, I've been meaning to get to that for a while. Yeah, go ahead and do it.
So you mentioned your first commit, and I started thinking about mine, and that made me think that this is another great thing that people who are interested in getting making contributions to the project should know is my first commit to Kubernetes was adding a flag. And 2 years later, I'm still making those commits of adding flags to Kubernetes. So adding flags, and like even if it's as simple as flipping a bit and adding an if statement somewhere further downstream in the program, those are really great ways to get your foot in the door as well.
Jeff, do you remember your first PR?
I do not. I think early stuff, I don't remember my very first PR. I know some of the early stuff I worked on was terrible bash hacking to make code coverage get reported properly. But I don't remember my very, very first commit.
What number PR introduced the, if this is too spammy, please ping XD?
That wasn't even a PR. I don't know if I should go into that. That was a fun story, but I don't know if that's relevant. We might have other questions. If we have time at the end, I can talk about that. That was a fun story.
Yeah, we do have some other questions. But no, that does sound like a fun story that I would like to get into. So this is a Go question. Are there any cscope-like tools for Go? They're curious if there's a fast and efficient way to hop between functions when you're reading through the code. Sally's shaking his head. Go ahead.
So there's definitely like a bunch of different editor plugins for doing stuff like that. They're not identical to cscope, but I think actually some of the Go Go has a series of like ancillary tools that are designed to help with some of that stuff, and I think a bunch of the plugins actually pull from some of those. So if you're using Vim, a lot of the plugins collected in Vim Go do that kind of stuff. And if you're not using Vim, I think you can take a look at the tools that are being called out from Vim Go, and I know for other editors, there's also similar sets of plugins.
I use Goland usually, and that has like a declaration lookup, which you can specify to either go to your local copy or to the copy that's in vendor if it's in a different package. And then I also use Emacs, and I base my Emacs. I had to bring it up. I'm sorry. Configuration on Spacemacs, and I use Helm, the package manager, and that has a Go plugin. Not Helm, the package manager for Kubernetes. Helm, the file system package manager for your file system in Emacs, and that is a handy way to hard files as well.
Jeff, do you have any suggestions?
I don't have any great recommendations, but I also haven't been doing a whole lot of Go coding, and so I'm certainly something to improve.
If you want to get really hardcore and you find something's missing and you can't seem to find a solution for it, the Go compiler built-in internals are actually, some of them are exposed in a library, and that's how some of the things like Go format and Go type are written. And you can actually go look at them, and some of those interfaces are not actually horrible to interact with, despite being partially compiler internals. So I know I have my own customized version of Go type. Not that that's completely necessary, but if you feel like making yourself more of a Go nut, it's a neat spot to take a look at.
All right.
I just want to toss in real quick. I think my first PR to Kubernetes also added a flag. So it's a good way to start.
Oh, Jeff, you looked. That's cute. All right. Do any of you, well, Chris already did, do any of you have questions for each other? No?
What's your favorite prow command?
/LGTM. It still is. It's my favorite one.
I like the combination of /LGTM/approve. It feels so like it feels like I have a giant rubber stamp and I'm just like, approved.
George, you have a favorite command?
You guys removed it. It was the shrug emoji guy. He was awesome. Sorry, I've got construction.
And we have a question about how do you pronounce, oh, that's Chris. I was like, dang, Chris. Chris just punked me. I wanted to ask this too. How do you pronounce cube control? Hint, I said it. No. Does anybody have a preferred pronunciation?
I started out saying cube cuddle a long time ago, and a lot of people gave me hell for that. So I decided to start saying cubectal to troll people. And I've been saying that for so long that I actually use it now, in the wild all the time. And it's gotten to the point where the joke has kind of faded off into the distance. And now I just genuinely say cubectal all the time, and it's hilarious.
So I say cube control, but I find that typing cube control is really long. And so if you find yourself working with a lot of Kubernetes, especially if you're testing a feature, pro tip, alias cube control to K. And then if you find yourself working with deploying system components, add another alias on top of that alias is KS to K-N cube system, and so on and so forth. And those speed up my typing a lot.
All right.
I'm in the cubectal camp, also cubetum.
The pronunciations in this project are so hilarious. I enjoy it. I just put a last call for questions out in Slack channel.
It's what people will argue the most. I've done this. It's cube cuddle,
Not
by the way.
Not technical specifics, but pronunciations. All right. Well, I think we should wrap this up. Actually, no, I think somebody's typing. George is right. George, you're just going to +1. All right. Last questions for each of you. Anything? All right. Well, this is a wrap for today's sessions for Meet Our Contributors. Thank you so much to Solly, Chris, Jeff, George on the 1s and 2s on YouTube, Luna, who is not in the background anymore. Bye, Luna. And I hope that we can have you all on another episode. And thanks again. Appreciate your time. Bye, y'all.